Thanks. Good morning, everybody. My name is Karen Groen. I'm the Senior Director for the Gender Group at the World Bank Group in Washington, D.C., and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this panel today, Women and Children Running from Violence, the Unfolding Refugee Crises in Central America. We have two keynote speakers and a really engaging panel, which I'll be introducing in just a minute. Let me just make one preliminary remark, which is while the international media and much of the attention has been focused on refugees arriving in Europe from countries such as Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, there is another crisis that has been unfolding in Central America for some time. Tens of thousands of women, either traveling alone or together with their children or other family members, have been fleeing a surging tide of violence in countries like El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and parts of Mexico. There's a recent UNHCR report, which will be discussed by our panelists, titled Women on the Run, that documents some of the very terrifying stories that explain why women and children have been forced to flee. And it talks about some of the issues they encounter from rape, assault, extortation, threats, and other issues. So we'll talk a lot about that, I'm sure, on this panel today. Let me introduce our first speaker, who is Mr. Shelley Pitterman, is that right? Who is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. He's the regional representative to the US and the Caribbean. He's based here in Washington, D.C. And he joined UNHCR in 1984 as a program officer in Sudan. He's managed field and country operations in Guinea, Burundi, and Kenya. And I'm really pleased to welcome him to the podium to launch us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. One of the first things that you've already said I was going to say, and that is that there's a much bigger global refugee crisis that we've been hearing about, and today we wanted to focus attention on what's going on in the Northern Triangle of Central America. Let me start with a quote. We cannot deny the humanitarian crisis. Each step, a journey laden with grave injustices, the enslaved, the imprisoned and extorted. So many of these brothers and sisters of ours are the consequences of trafficking in human beings. Injustices radicalized in the young, persecuted and threatened when they try to flee the spiral of violence and the hell of drugs. This is the Pope speaking a couple of weeks ago from the border between the United States and Mexico, giving clarity and articulating the simple fact that we are indeed facing a looming refugee crisis, if you will, concerning individuals, children, men and women, leaving individually or in families, coming from principally the three countries of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, but also from Mexico. The refugees in the Americas are, as I said, coming from the three countries, and there has been an evolution in recent years of continuous violence, high rates of homicide and femicide that's generating this flow. The fact that it's looming and that it's a refugee crisis allows for some concerted action to avoid that it becomes a crisis of crisis proportions. But we've already seen over the recent years that the numbers continue to grow, and I will conclude my remarks shortly by talking about what kinds of solutions we can envisage. People are leaving because of staggering levels of gang violence, combined with an inability of states to manage or to control the situation, with high levels of impunity for criminal activity. We've had some early warning indicators that should signal red flags, if you will, over the recent years. You see on the right side the increasing numbers of asylum seekers coming to the United States from the Northern Triangle as well as from Mexico. This is until 2014. In 2015, the numbers even doubled or more than doubled beyond this bar graph. And on the left side, you see, while the numbers are smaller, a significant increase, very significant increase over the last 5 years in the numbers of people seeking asylum in Panama, in Costa Rica, and points south from the Northern Triangle. A 1,200% increase, in fact, since 2008. Another element, of course, is that in Costa Rica, just to give you an indication of the changing nature of the flow, in Costa Rica, for the first time, there are more asylum seekers from the Northern Triangle than there have been over recent years from Colombia. And the recognition rates for asylum seekers are significantly high. In Nicaragua, they're 100%, and even in the United States, among the 16,000 women who went through the first interviews with the Department of Homeland Security last year that we're aware of, 82% of them were found to have a credible fear of persecution and therefore a well-founded basis for proceeding in the asylum process. So there is clear evidence that within the overall flow or migration of individuals between North and South from Central America, that there's a significant number of refugees, people who need protection for various reasons relating to gang violence, domestic violence, political opinion, and persecution in general. What we tried to do in our report last year, which was also which was preceded by a report on children on the run, was to tell the stories of some of the women that we were able to interview in the United States who had already made their claims for asylum. We talked to about 160 women, and they told stories, as Karen indicated, that reflected not only the pains and the fear that prompted them to leave in the first place, but also the suffering that they experienced en route to the United States via Mexico more often than not. So we welcome you to have a look at a synopsis of some of the stories and to visit the website womenonthedot.run, where you can see videos and read more individual stories about the women who were fleeing persecution. Well, they're fleeing the highest homicide. This is, I think, fairly common knowledge, but nevertheless, I think it's important to reiterate that the three countries of the Northern Triangle have among the highest homicide rates in the world. And while there have been some trends to reduction to a certain extent over the last couple of years, they still remain among the 5 highest most violent countries in the world. In fact, there have been comparisons made to the risk of death in El Salvador or in Honduras being as high as in Aleppo or in other areas where there is active conflict. I don't want to preempt I don't want to do an analysis of that. It's just to say that there's remarkable violence, it's unpredictable, there's impunity, and people therefore feel very much afraid. There's also evidence to suggest that the majority of the people who are leaving these countries are first trying to find safety within the country, either by moving to another city to stay with family or friends, but because they're fleeing transnational criminal organizations that have networks within the country throughout, more often than not, they end up suffering the consequence and having to leave as well. The 160 women that we interviewed therefore spoke about pervasive systemic violence, repeated harm, extortion, threats, physical abuse, rape, and so on. And they reported not only crimes against their children or against their siblings or against their relatives, but obviously they themselves, more often than not, reported direct violence against themselves. There are certain subpopulations like transgender individuals, LGBT individuals that suffer particular harm. Now, UNHCR has been actively pursuing with governments as well as with NGOs every effort to find a regional solution to this situation. There's no way that one country, whether it's Mexico or the United States or Panama, Costa Rica, could on its own address this situation. We have been using similar appeals as we have in Europe. to say that there has to be a mechanism in place for registration, for access to asylum procedures, for safety, in particular for children, for counseling and psychosocial care, pending the identification of solutions for each individual, whether it's through settlement and local integration and access to livelihood activities, or through resettlement to another country. And there has been some movement as well, obviously, as many of you are aware, of initiatives by the United States government to invest more through the Interdevelopment Bank and through other mechanisms to support activities that would hopefully ground individuals who are now afraid to be able to stay in the home countries and to focus on some of the root causes of the situation. But those will take time, and we've seen over recent months that the flow of children alone, as well as women and children and some whole families, is keeping up to a very significant extent. The narrative is still one of irregular migration, illegal migrants, which is a bit discouraging, because to frame it as a refugee situation, even within the context of a mixed migration, obliges states under international law, under national law, to undertake certain measures that would provide assurances of protection, or at least access to procedures, so that an individual can make her claim, his claim, in order to be heard and hopefully to be able to get the protection that they need. So UNHCR has been pursuing this in a proactive way, principally with the United States, with Mexico, as well as with other countries of asylum in the region. We have a three-pronged strategy focused on building asylum systems, and we've been in direct contact, of course, with the United States and with Mexico, Costa Rica, to ensure that they have the capacity to receive individuals, to hear them out, and to address their protection needs. This requires resources. There's no question about that, but most fundamentally, first, it requires a political will to acknowledge the nature of the problem that states are being confronted with, and have been now in a very serious way for the last couple of years. Protection during displacement is important to be able to ensure that children, women, people with special needs are protected even during the course of their flight, and certainly upon arrival in the country of asylum, or where they are making their claims. And not least of all is the importance of solutions, addressing the root causes, but also identifying opportunities for individuals who are found to be in need of individual protection to access, as I mentioned before, measures that would give them independence through livelihoods activities in southern Mexico, for example, or access to family reunification, or to resettlement to the United States or to other countries where it would show a regional solidarity and allow for the individuals to thrive and to start their new future in safety. So UNHCR is very excited about the prospect of moving forward with this. We've been in contact, of course, with the 3 countries of origin. And here I would just note that insofar as the countries themselves feel a certain, they're weak in terms of being able to protect their own citizens, but they want to find solutions with us. So we find ourselves very often in the unusual situation of talking to countries of asylum, countries of origin who are actually engaged to try to find solutions for their nationals when they're outside the country. And you have consular services, for example, from El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala, working in the United States quite proactively. And the people who are fleeing those countries are not afraid to talk to people from government. They're not fleeing authority. It's the weakness of the authority that has led them to flee in the first place. So with those few remarks, I would like to close with a quote from somebody else that we all recognize. We've been witness of too many cases of torture and violence used to intimidate journalists and citizens, extrajudicial executions, cartels acting with impunity, and too many parents crying for the loss of their children due to violence. We will continue to be honest with the authorities on how we perceive these matters, and will search for new ways to help. This is Vice President Joe Biden speaking just this week in Mexico about the situation in Mexico and working with the Mexican authorities. But I think the same can very well be said for the nature of the problem and the search that's underway with the authorities as well in El Salvador, Honduras, and in Guatemala. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Shelley. I would like to call our panelists to the stage. I'm going to be introducing them, if I can invite you up as they are walking up. I'd first like to introduce Ms. Alexis de Simon. She's a Senior Program Officer for Central America and Central Programs at the Solidarity Center, which works with labor unions and rights organizations around the world. She's helped to develop and implement informal economy programs with market vendors, with street vendors, construction workers, and domestic workers in Central America, Brazil, and Mozambique. And we welcome you here, Alexis. Our second panelist is Alma Couverti, and she joined an organization that's very well known here in this area called Casa de Maryland. I was asking what it stands for. Nobody remembers what Casa stands for anymore, but we think it's the Central American Solidarity Association. She is the Senior Director of Organizing and held the Director of Welcome Centers and Education. Prior to that, she was a community organizer in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and she's been long involved in developing leadership skills and institutes and multi-ethnic organizing. And finally, I'm very pleased to welcome Padre Alejandro Solalinde, who has, for more than 7 years, worked full-time on the defense of migrants that cross the border from Central America through Mexico to get into the United States. And he's been a parson for several communities in different states in Mexico, such as Oaxaca and Mexico City, and he's worked with indigenous communities in that country. After our panel, I'm going to start with some initial questions. I'd like to open the floor to you to ask our panelists some questions, and then we're going to invite Mr. Luca Dal Oglio up to the podium, who's the Chief of Mission of the International Organization for Migration, to give some concluding remarks. Padre Solalinde does not speak English, so we are going to have simultaneous translation. You should have headsets available to enable full understanding. Okay. I'm going to start with somewhat of a general question, but I'm going to tailor it a little bit specifically to our panelists. And I'm going to start with Padre Solalinde, if I may. I'm particularly interested in, from the perspective of the work that you do, for the two of you who work on this side of the border, and for Padre Solalinde, who works in Mexico, how do you see the causes that lead to, and I'm going to distinguish here what is quote unquote forced displacement versus voluntary displacement of women and girls versus men and boys. There may be some differential causes. And specifically, I'd like you to touch on the role that gender-based violence plays, particularly in countries of origin, but as well on this side once people get here. Now, Padre Solalinde, I'm interested in what's happening specifically in Mexico and where you see the issues playing out in terms of gang violence, in terms of the economic situation. So let's start with you in terms of the situation. And if you can comment as well on the refugees or the people coming from the other countries in that Northern Triangle through Mexico. Are there differences in Honduras, in Guatemala, in El Salvador than in Mexico? What do you see across these different populations? Let's start with you.
Bueno, yo veo primero que nada que esta violencia global se da lo mismo en el flujo África-Europa que América, Estados Unidos, México, Estados Unidos. Pero se concentra exactamente el punto más débil en las mujeres y los niños. Podríamos decir que en ellas está toda la violencia de que es capaz la humanidad y de ensañarse sobre todo con ellas y con niños. Son los sectores más vulnerables. Puedo presentar un caso paradigmático que representa todo esto que estoy diciendo. El caso de Marilú, de Guatemala. Ella, muy joven, muy chica, fue entregada prácticamente por su madre a un hombre que la pretendía, un hombre ya mayor, y ella sufre todo tipo de violencia. La violencia de la pobreza económica, pero también cultural, pero también religiosa. Toda esa formación cultural que venimos cargando y que no hay ninguna protección para la mujer. Ella se queja de golpes, de malos tratos, se queja con la mamá, regresa con la mamá y le dice, es que este hombre me maltrata, me pega, me trata muy mal. Sí, pero es tu esposo y él tiene derecho a hacerlo porque por eso es tu esposo. Entonces ella va con la policía, presenta una denuncia y le dice, es que no tiene derecho a quejarse porque es su esposo y tiene derecho a hacerlo. Finalmente, ella se harta de esto y desea salir de ahí y emigra hacia Estados Unidos. En México tiene un accidente, el tren le corta un pie y ella es abandonada por el pollero, por la persona que la iba guiando, y entonces ella llega a nuestro albergue con la autoestima mínima. Ahí tenemos que darle atención, estuvo algún tiempo con nosotros, aprendió un oficio, le pusieron una prótesis, pudo rehacer su vida con otra persona. Las condiciones de origen, pero también el primer infierno, que es el de origen, pero el segundo infierno, que es el de México, también requiere de una atención. Ellas son muy resilientes, pero son personas que necesitan también atención para reconstruir su vida. Marilú se quedó en Monterrey, está casada con una persona que también sufrió una mutilación. Hoy es tratada pues bien, ¿verdad? Ha sido apoyada por varias instituciones y creo que aquel pasado quedó atrás. Sus hijos que se habían quedado con su abuela recibieron también atención y pienso que este es un ejemplo para reflexionar, ver las causas que son muchas, son estructurales, son sistémicas, pero también son culturales y también todas y todos tenemos que ver para solucionar los problemas de origen, pero también para ver las posibilidades que tienen hoy ante el agravamiento de esta crisis que el agente de ACNUR mencionaba, el representante del alto comisionado, para que haya una convergencia de voluntades políticas, pero también institucionales y también agenciales de la ONU para buscar una protección para este tipo de personas vulnerables.
So let me just ask you a quick follow-up question. Do you see, I imagine you're seeing increasing numbers in the last few years in your shelters. Are there differences in the people who are coming through today in the last year or so versus previously?
Sí, sí, esto es claro. Nosotros hemos visto incrementar esta cifra desde hace 2 años. De hecho, gracias al apoyo de ACNUR, tenemos ahora ya terminado una construcción especial para niños, niñas y para mujeres, para familias, con un jardín pequeño pero muy hermoso, un pequeño auditorio para los niños y también una área para las mujeres más digna, donde podemos decir que ellas al menos ahí tienen un lugar seguro para sus niños y un lugar digno también para ellas, que ellas lo merecen.
Thanks. So, Alma, let me turn to you now. CASA is one of the most important organizations representing and welcoming migrants, those who are forcibly displaced in this area of Washington, D.C. What do you see as the reasons for people coming here? Who ends up at CASA? What are some of the issues related to forced displacement, and both for men as well as for women? And speak about both, and distinct from the three countries.
Yes, in this new or more recent wave of immigrants, the common thread is fleeing violence. And but when we talk about women, it's so layered and it's so deeply rooted. I am glad that you mentioned culture and religion, because that plays a big deal. And the reason why it is so important is when they come here, they flee that environment of violence. And in CASA, we provide them with services trying to attend to their well-being and also trying to attend to their ability to thrive with their families, to advance economically. And what we have found out is that that ingrained culture doesn't leave them. It is still with them. And it's very easy in a country of peace to fall again back into patterns of violence by the building of new relationships that resemble old patterns and behaviors, and by shortchanging yourself and thinking that those opportunities that you have afforded for you are not for people like me, because that's not what women do, because that's not our place. We actually started a program, and I was so excited to get money. You know how hard it is to find childcare support for programs for women? It is ridiculous, but it is. And we were able to find it, and it's been so difficult and so hard to inspire and recruit women into this program, because their first thought is that that is not for me. And they are choosing other paths that resemble what they know. The interventions that have to happen are deep and are also multi-layered. And they have to address the gender imbalances that we all women first face in the world, and the violence that we all face. And I know that if we show a raise of hands here, we're gonna see that a lot of us have been touched by gender violence, one way or another. And if that is our case, then imagine having to do it in a place of war, or in a place where gangs are raiding and controlling everything. Gangs, by the way, were exported to that country. They did not have a gang issue before. They came from the United States. So we also need to think about the role that we have played in the lives of these women that are coming here looking for a chance at life and at freedom.
Great. Let me ask you. Let me ask you a follow-up question, which is something that is a difficult issue and hard to be able to change. So it's a two-part question. The first is, you said that the common thread is people are fleeing violence, and I think that men are probably fleeing a different type of violence than women. Do men have this, and you mentioned this issue of culture, so women may be more accepting of gender-based violence because it's the husband's right, for instance, so it's an intimate partner violence issue, than the kind of violence that men face. How do you think about these?
Let's layer psychovirus on top of all of this.
Let's talk a little bit about these layers.
So on top of the gang violence and the domestic violence, now we have environmental factors. Now it's also the spread of the psychovirus. And in a country where you go to jail if you have an abortion, and that is very, very difficult to find birth control. The response of the government is don't get pregnant. So this is El Salvador, and this was reported in the press. So this is also another phase of violence towards women. and the reason why it is actually very dangerous if you're a woman to live in that country right now. And in the issue of the gangs and men, what we see, unfortunately, are women that are bringing their children, so they, boys in this case, so they don't fall prey of the gangs, so they are not recruited. And then unfortunately, they come into places where the gangs already exist. So again, the interventions have to be multi-layered, but also have to happen here as well. So it's not only to intervene in those countries, we have to do interventions for the ones who are already here. There is no way that they can be sent back under the conditions that those countries are in. So making those investments in the country is extremely important. So people don't have to choose to flee in the first place. But the ones that are here also, they deserve a chance to live and to actually have all those services in here as well.
Thank you. Alexis, you work with the Solidarity Center. Maybe I can ask you to talk a little bit about some of the economic issues behind displacement, behind migration, voluntary and forced in the three countries, and for both males as well as for females.
So our office for the sub-region is headquartered in Guatemala, but we also have a satellite office in Honduras, in San Pedro Sula, which I think up until a couple of months ago was the city with the highest murder rate in the world, and we're now opening an office in El Salvador. And our work centers around workers' rights and helping those workers exercise those rights, most often through the formation of unions, which is a recognized civil society actor that in many circumstances is the most capable and sometimes the only capable actor of demanding accountability from governments. And if you look at these countries that have a history of civil war, of repressive governments, of shrinking spaces for civil societies, a place where the most ordinary of citizens, your everyday workers, can come together to articulate their demands and then push for those, is a really vital function to ensure that whatever traces of democracy exist will be able to rebound, and that there might be some kind of accountability and real governance. If you look at women, women are overrepresented in the informal economy. Domestic workers are, depending on the country, around, between 95 and 99% women workers. Market and street vendors also overrepresent women workers. If you look at the maquila industry, again, women workers are overrepresented, and these are some of the industries with the highest rates of sexual violence, occupational safety and health hazards, the lowest wages, and the least benefits. I would also throw in agricultural workers, where you also have high incidences of child labor, of sexual violence in the fields. And so if you look at the industries where women work, where unions are traditionally the weakest, I think you can point out that there's a very, very clear line or number of lines between poverty, corruption, and violence. And all of those things are push factors on women workers, on the children of those workers, and of course on men as well. I think one of the really important things to look at is the intersection not only of women as poor workers, but so often factors of migration, rural to urban migration, of race for indigenous women and Afro-descendant women, and for migrants from one country to another facing added layers of vulnerability that make it so much harder for them to demand their rights. And when they can't demand their rights, or when they make those demands and the government is unwilling or incapable of responding to those demands, women have very little option with what to do. I'll talk about like a very mundane thing. In Honduras, in its kind of last, couple of days of the previous Congress, they passed something like 120 laws in a period of days that nobody had the time to read. Many of those labor laws made it much easier to have irregular employment and part-time employment. And so employers could unilaterally say, you're now going to work 3 4-hour shifts in a row instead of your regular shift. Well, maybe that doesn't sound so bad in a vacuum, but what about when you have children at home? Who's going to take care of those children? Your children are now more vulnerable to recruitment by gangs, to violence by whoever could be around them, and I think that's kind of just one little prick that shows the enormity of this problem.
So are some of the economic factors for migrating different for women than for men as a result of the sectors that they work in or the precarious nature of the jobs? Or
from conversations that I've had and from, I think, generalized research in each of the countries, most of the women workers who we talk with are single mothers. And so they're responsible not only for themselves, but for their whole family, very often with the lowest wages in the country. And I'll say that women are not only in the sectors with the lowest wages and the least benefits, but in any workplace where you don't have a union collective bargaining agreement, women make sense on the man's dollar. And so it's compounded both by the industry and by that, universal discrimination against women. That's one particular challenge. Another challenge is a lot of times, even in places where there is a union, men might be the heads of the unions in women-dominated industries. And so, of course, that's one of our areas of work, is to increase women's leadership and representation, to be able to advocate their own interests. I think something that we hear a lot from women is that their economic concerns and their reasons to migrate and to seek some kind of semblance of safety and resources for their children is that their concerns aren't purely economic. It's very often reiterated that when you're the only one responsible for the well-being of your child and you don't have access to a place for childcare or for some of those or safe transportation to get home at the end of your shift that ends at 2 in the morning, it adds a lot more layers to the simply economic reasonings.
Right. Okay, Shelley, let me come to you, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. You had talked about, and I think you're absolutely right, that the crisis right now needs regional solutions. No country can do it on its own. So are the countries in negotiating sort of a regional approach, recognizing issues of gender-based violence, other issues that may affect men differently than women? How is that coming to the fore in the discussion of a regional approach? And then what is the specific measures that the countries themselves are willing to take, whether it's on the security front or on the economic front, to try to reduce the crisis?
From my knowledge, the short answer to your first question is no, not yet.
Okay.
That there's still, we're still working to establish really the broader parameters and focus on procedures and policies. But to the extent that we engage in that together with individual states and collectively through regional organizations, hopefully as well with the OAS as a bit of a chapeau, that dimension, the gender dimension, will necessarily have to come forward. Individual states are certainly doing things with a gender sensitivity, whether it's in the United States, the way they're detained, and also perhaps more positively on other dimensions, in terms of understanding the asylum claims. But there is also work, as you mentioned, Father, in individual states working to try to reinforce capacity, but it's still very small scale. And one of the things that I didn't mention, just to give a shout out, would be to explore more systematically what is also happening with the Inter-American Development Bank, with the World Bank, to take stock of activities and initiatives that are underway or planned, and to see to what extent there's synergy in the development work underway or planned, and how that can help address in a preventative way some of the challenges that we're facing in terms of this mixed migration and the challenges of forced displacement.
Great. I'd like to move us to the context of solutions. What do we do about this problem? And before I open it up, I'm going to ask the Padre Solalindo. Obviously, the need is greater than the resources currently that we have. But from your perspective, where's the most urgent place that we need to work on in the short term? And where do you think we need to really go in terms of the longer term, in both terms of your capacity, your network of churches, but the roles of other actors like local governments or the state, national government as well?
Como dijo el representante del Alto Comisionado para los Refugiados de la ONU, la crisis es evidente y necesitamos primero hacer una reflexión profunda de lo que está pasando, sacar un diagnóstico honesto, ¿sí? Con la visión del sur, del tránsito y del norte. Después, explorar la voluntad política de los estados, no solamente para hacer documentos o leyes, sino también para cumplirlas, pero también que exista el compromiso de entidades, instituciones como la Iglesia Católica, que ha sido factor del mantenimiento y de la vigencia de prejuicios como el machismo, la visión patriarcal que ha mantenido a la mujer por 2000 años en la situación que está. La Iglesia Católica sigue siendo factor de vigencia cultural de estos prejuicios y de estas relaciones viciadas. Por eso se tiene que entender el compromiso regional. La Iglesia está en Centroamérica, la Iglesia está en tránsito, la Iglesia está también en destino. Y luego también tratar de hacer una reflexión para que todos y todas tratemos de ayudar a esta crisis humanitaria que se está dando, que cada quien haga lo suyo y por supuesto que se vea con toda honestidad que es un problema sistémico, estructural, cultural y también social.
Thank you. Well, I think we have time for 2 questions before we go to our final speaker. I'd like to ask the woman to stand up and come to the microphone. Please identify yourself, and then I'll go to the woman in the back. We're going to take questions together, and then we'll have our panelists be able to respond.
Hola, padre. Un honor conocerlo. I'm from Mexico as well, and I consider myself as a displaced person because I have to move from my city, Tamaulipas, to the center of Mexico because they were abusing sexually girls for no reason at all. So I was no longer safe in my city, and this is a topic that really affects me, and I was really interested into coming here and listening to the proposals and the policies that you make and that the institutions are making for the governments to protect the citizens and give us safety, because I don't feel safe in my country, and I want to feel safe, and I want to know what are the institutions doing. I was working with a group of friends to actually address these topics about migration, and we were searching for data, and we were finding nothing at all of people who were migrating, and we found out that there was actually a change in the routes of migrants, and they were not able to actually get to the shelters that were before. So now they're like lost in places, and they're vulnerable to cartels and violence at least in Mexico. And I think this is a really important topic, and I think it's important that there are made policies that make us, the citizens, feel safe, and that also protect the women and the youth and the children, at least in all these countries that are affected by this topic.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So what are I'm going to just policies for safety. We'll come back to the panel, and then perhaps, Shelley, you can answer the question about data, because I think it is actually really important. Let me go to the second microphone and ask you to go ahead and ask your question and introduce yourself, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Cordelia Chestnut, and I work at the World Bank here in Washington. We have a program called the Global Program on Forced Displacement that tries to improve the development response to displacement, and we're very happy to see how development actors, including the bank, are really tackling this issue in a big way, as you can see here at the forum. And increasingly, from an operational perspective, teams are coming to us and saying, what should we do differently? Because the bank and other development actors have a very traditional approach to development that focuses on community-driven development, on livelihoods, on capacity building, but we're trying to think of what are the innovative approaches. How can you address sexual and gender-based violence? How can you do things differently? So if the panel could offer any ideas for us on specific operational components or ways of implementing differently to both prevent and to address the development dimensions of displacement from a gender perspective, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, great. Last question.
Hello, I'm originally from Costa Rica. I got married very, very young, and I am a survivor of domestic violence. I know firsthand what it feels to be really scared of somebody going to kill you and having to protect yourself and your son. Violence against women, it is not tied to social class or educational background. I have a PhD, and it's not tied to that. It's not only poverty, poor women, or it's not tied to that or to race. However, I do know that I am one of the fortunate ones that had the economic and human capital to find ways of getting away from my violent husband. And I had the opportunity to come to the US and study. However, I acknowledge that my opportunity or the opportunities that I had were not the same ones that most and the majority of women in Central America do not have. But they should.
Can I ask you to ask your question? Because we're going to run
Yes.
short of time. Thank you.
My question is, what is the World Bank and the UN doing together? What are they collaborating on? What kind of initiatives are you working on to help governments in Central America provide the opportunities to these women who actually do not have them? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to go back to our panelists to answer the questions, and I think I'm going to start with women first. I will ask Alma, if you will, perhaps you can talk a little bit more about the sexual and gender-based violence, the different approaches that you see working.
Well, one of the approaches that I've seen working, it's actually, oh, I am so sorry. I think that you can hear me back there. It's actually in El Salvador, and it's a project that I believe the World Bank is already very much working with, and it's the project of Ciudad Mujer, which provides an integral approach to gender inequality. And it addresses the needs of women in what they call the four pillars. So it is sexual and reproductive health, ending domestic violence, economic independence, and then I forgot the
Justice.
program. And then, yes, knowing your rights, social justice. And that is very important because of the issues that we talk and how ingrained the culture of violence is within us. It is teaching women to live differently and to relate to one another and to men as well and their children in a much better way. So, and the other thing that we should be looking at in terms of the region is at what's happening in Nicaragua. Nicaragua, being so close to all of these countries, does not have the levels of violence that reflects and does not have a gang problem. Why is that? We should be looking at what Nicaragua is doing at the social and economic level to prevent the spread of violence that has plagued the other countries to reach their country.
Any ideas on what they are doing?
I think it has to do with a revolution, but I am going to leave it there.
Alexis.
I think probably the most important thing that not only like NGOs and civil society organizations could do, but that donor governments especially can make sure that funds are directed towards is investing in women as leaders, investing in their ability not only to gain skills in terms of leadership, but also their capacity to educate their peers and empowering them to be able to try to hold their governments and employers and other parties accountable because they are the only ones who know so intimately what they're facing, what their needs are, and what the most appropriate responses would be. For our part, we're investing in women as leaders at their work sites and helping them to lead unions. And as a complement to that, we're educating male union leaders about what it takes to be a responsible counterpart in that feminism. And so in Honduras, they call it their masculinity course. and they call it different things in different countries, but it's really important. I'm going to quickly point out Guatemala has overtaken Colombia as the deadliest country to be a trade unionist. Honduras has seen its violence against trade unionists skyrocket since the coup. And something really important about that is on top of the murders of trade unionists, there's widespread threats of violence and sexual harassments that's used to intimidate women leaders. And it's very often not recognized as such because the violence against women is so broad. They assume she's sexually harassed at work because sexual harassment is so broad, not because we want to intimidate her into being quiet and not speaking up on behalf of her coworkers. Or even worse, you know, you have people who are just simply victim blaming and saying she's sexually harassed at work because she asked for it, or whatever other horrible reasons they could ask for. And so one of the key things that we're integrating into our basic labor rights education and outreach trainings is how to recognize gender-based violence and gender-based violence at work, because it's inseparable from all the other work that we're trying to do to make sure that people can defend their rights, can speak out on their own behalf and advocate their interests. And it's critical not just for women workers, but for all workers. Maybe Alma, in my pretend workplace where we, you know, pack bananas, maybe Alma would be an amazing leader that's going to negotiate, you know, a huge raise for me, or is going to make sure that government inspections actually happen. But she's so cowed into silence because of the sexual harassment or, you know, the sexual violence that she's facing at work that she's not able to speak out. And that's going to hurt me, regardless of whether I'm a man or a woman. And so it's critical, I think, for workers generally to be able to address that.
Great, thank you. Shelley, maybe you can say a word about the data.
Sure. It's very important first that this meeting is happening, that Central America, these three countries, are acknowledged to be fragile states, along with so many of the others, regrettably, around the world. That understanding has not come to the centers of power. And to the extent that there is an acknowledgement that there's insecurity and that there are people moving, more often than not, it's framed as they're coming here for family reunification, they're coming here because of administration policies that are attracting them, that are creating magnets for movement. And all of our conversation has been about the push factors. Therefore, my point on the data and a couple of other points that were raised is that whatever's happening now is happening on too small a scale. Whatever individual states are doing, they're not doing with sufficient collaboration. There isn't a strategy, multi-year, oriented towards addressing root causes that would address forced displacement concerns, the kinds of issues that we've been talking about. And a key element to that, and one of the things that we've put on our agenda as a first action, is to indeed focus in on data, analysis, evidence. Not that it will necessarily reframe the narrative, because evidence is not always always paid attention to. But we need to have it in terms of designing proposals and programs that can make a difference in the lives of women and children and others affected by the situation in the three countries.
Great. Padre, any final words from the panel before we turn to our final speaker?
Sí. Gracias por la pregunta. ¿Qué tenemos que hacer diferente? ¿Qué tenemos que hacer distinto? Ustedes y yo nacimos en un sistema capitalista que ha generado cierta lógica y desde ahí nos parece todo normal. ¿Qué tenemos que hacer? Reducir la visión de importancia que tiene el dinero y ponerla al servicio del ser humano. Darle a Dios el lugar que le corresponde, que se lo ha arrebatado precisamente el mercado, el dinero. Y así las cosas se acomodan, porque lo más importante es la gente, es el ser humano. Los niños y las mujeres no son las más golpeados, pero no las únicas víctimas de violencia. Por eso necesitamos revisar todo con nuevos referentes para reacomodar todo y buscar una vida incluyente, sin violencia y obviamente con la prioridad de atención con las personas más vulnerables. La pobreza y la seguridad humana no merecen atención romántica, porque son una vergüenza sistémica y se tiene que dar una respuesta integral.
Thank you so much. I'm going to invite Mr. Luca Dalloglio up to the podium, and I'll introduce him in a minute. But let me just say, in response to the question about the World Bank, we actually, for task team leaders here at the bank, but perhaps for others, have a new resource guide for how to integrate the interventions and approaches to both preventing and responding to gender-based violence in different sectors, whether it's in a transport operation, whether it's in education, whether it's in social protection and labor. And we're in the process of developing a new chapter that focuses on violence prevention and response in the context of humanitarian and fragile situations. And this is a really important resource. We collaborate on this with the Inter-American Development Bank, with George Washington University, and there's very specific approaches, everything from the one-stop shop type of model to the types of training and awareness raising that works, but it goes really beyond that. But this is a really handy resource, and it's on the World Bank website. So let me just introduce you. Luca Dalloglio is the Chief of Mission of the International Organization for Migration based here in Washington. Prior to this assignment, he was Special Envoy of the Director General of the IOM for Haiti, starting from 2010, and we're really delighted to have him here to close the panel. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for having inserted this very compelling panel into the Fragility Forum. I think it's an excellent and innovative idea to do so. I would like to start this last intervention with a quote, and I take it in Spanish. Si pudiera arreglar el mundo, mi mundo, buscaría una familia que me quisiera para vivir con ella, donde encontraría cariño y apoyo. Alguien que me salve, alguien que me cuide, alguien que dé la vida por mí. This is a little story of a booklet called Caminos de Luz y Sombras, which collects the stories of the children on the move, interviewed throughout their long and arduous migratory process towards North America. Invariably, all these stories contain a double story of abuse. The abuse that has led them to flee and the abuse that they encounter on the move. And it's very sad that we have to face this double challenge, which is, on the one hand, trying to address the drivers of these movements, but on the other hand, trying to protect the people on the move. And I think my remarks are in these directions. As an agency that is concerned with the migration, we need to see how we can have this double approach, because are both extremely relevant and one has enormous humanitarian implications. So, how to support the rights of people on the move in the absence of a framework, an adequate framework, and in situation of institutional weaknesses. We heard from the panelists the various multifaceted level of interventions at the community level, national level, regional levels, but also the multiple actors involved. National authorities, of course, but also non-governmental organizations, faith-based organizations, international organizations. And I think this is the way to go, these large coalitions of different organizations, including migrant organizations, well organized. Because this is we call it a mixed flows, is a complex dynamic. Sometimes it's called survival migration. Doesn't have necessarily all the characteristics, the legal characteristic of one single phenomenon, and we need to have systems that are flexible enough to cater for a multiple different often victims of these situations. The takeaway message is that, in my view, is that one, the current framework is inadequate to protect both refugees and others who are forced to move, and two, that we have an array of tools to fill this gap, develop innovative practical solutions, and alleviate predictable sufferings. But these tools and practices need to be more consistently applied in all the countries. There is no single answer to prevent violence and protect vulnerable migrants. However, there are many steps we can all take to lower these vulnerabilities through innovative practices, from capacity building for government officials and civil society, migration governance policy developments, direct assistance to the vulnerable migrants, and addressing the root causes of violence and the drivers of unsafe migration. We are saying is that we are seeing people running away from violence and yet facing another kind of violence. Running away from violence is no guarantee to safety. On the contrary, escaping violence is in communities of origin often exposes women and children to human rights abuses throughout the whole migration cycle. Unstable and violent environment lead to a reduction of governance and law enforcement capacities to protect all social strata of population, in particular those at the social and economic margins. Without recourses to the rule of law and access to protection mechanisms, the affected population is forced to undertake high-risk migration, which while in transit expose vulnerable migrants to additional violence, including smuggling, trafficking, and exploitation, especially egregious forms of gender-based violence, by criminal networks operating with a reduced likelihood of being detected. IOM recently has carried out a research on a number of crisis settings, including natural disaster and generalized violence. Among more than the 15 countries that we have assessed, women and children clearly resulted as one of the most vulnerable groups. In this context, women and children can sometimes be forced or having to resort to transactional survival sex in exchange of food, transport, and money. We know that experiences of migrant women are not homogeneous. However, we do know from our daily work with vulnerable populations, and in particular victims of human trafficking, that women and children face series of vulnerabilities at every stage of the migration process. In the countries of origin, as well as in transit, sexual violence can affect as many as 50% of migrant women. In countries of destination, women often have no other choice but to enter informal labor market with few labor controls and safeguards. Addressing violence, conflict, and fragility goes hand in hand with developing and implementing security and protection strategies. There is no security or prosperity at community, national, or regional level without security for women and for children. On top of our agenda is prevention of violence against women, whether it occurs at home, domestic violence, or in communities, and drives women and girls to migrate, or whether it is perpetrated along the migratory route by human traffickers and other criminal gangs. Long-term action, not necessarily linked to migration management, are necessary to deal with these drivers. What works well, and we have experienced firsthand in Central America, is investment in communities. For example, through partnership with the government of El Salvador and UNFPA, we work with 10 communities in El Salvador on institutional strengthening and developing municipal plans for the prevention of violence against women, with emphasis on prevention of trafficking in municipalities with high incidence of this crime. More programming is needed to replicate this model, and related activities such as training and awareness sessions on gender-based violence, gender equality, violence and trafficking, targeting governmental actors and local, national, and regional level. We have seen a good reception of human rights and gender-based training delivered to official workings as service providers, but also those in the security sector and border management. Prevention can also be facilitated by more predictable and facilitated migration avenues, such as reduced timeline for family reunification, temporary labor migration schemes, or education opportunities abroad. The search for gender-sensitive principled and low-risk migration management arrangements. We have examples. Some of these examples do represent suitable opportunities. In-country processing is something that we conduct often jointly with the UNHCR and is active in Central America now to provide some 6,000 opportunities for victims of violence as refugees to move to the US or as parolee. At the moment, there are some 4,000 minors throughout this pipeline process, and we expect this project to be completed by the end of the year with some 6,000 applicants. We also have safe transit along the route. The experiences that have just been mentioned is also another avenue to increase protection. The network of shelter and safe houses are possible only because of the close collaboration with civil society in providing safe haven to women and children on the run through network of shelters. Our programs offer modest support to tireless efforts of the Scalabrinian congregation in coming to aid to the most vulnerable children in Guatemala, Casa Alianza in Honduras, Jesus El Buen Pastor in Mexico, and many others. Lastly, regional cooperation mechanisms to focus on migrant-friendly, gender-sensitive, practical solutions. As we have seen recently, with the safe corridors arranged for certain group of Caribbean migrants, regional cooperation can alleviate sufferings and reduce vulnerabilities. The Regional Conference on Migration, or Puebla Conference, offers a platform for exchange of information and problem-solving for Central American and North American countries, which could be mobilized better. The Regional Forum promotes humane migration management agenda, such as human rights of migrants, regardless of status, with special attention to vulnerable groups, such as women and children, ensuring international protection for refugees and vulnerable migrants, enhancing cooperation in the return and reintegration of repatriated migrants, and promoting cooperation to combat smuggling and trafficking in persons. To close, this year will be the year of International Initiative on Migration. There will be shortly coming up the World Humanitarian Summit in May, and in September, United Nations General Assembly dedicated to these very issues. I hope that the enormous attention that the issue of migration and the refugee is taken in the Mediterranean will not eclipse the need to focus on a global strategy which is also able to address what we've been discussing here today. Thank you for taking this initiative.
And I'd like you to join me in thanking our excellent speakers for this very informative session and discussion. Thank you.
And can I just add, I've left a couple of reports on the intersection of trade, migration, and violence. I'm looking specifically at Honduras. There's copies in English and Spanish at the front.